Good afternoon, everyone. Patrick Brenner here, president of the Southwest Public Policy Institute. Thank you so much for tuning in today for another episode of SPPI-TV, the public policy podcast of the Institute. We're on episode 17. What is the right minimum wage? And I think that both of our hosts today, Dowd Muska, Vice President of Research here at the Institute, and Rebekah Paxton, our guest, are going to agree that the right minimum wage is zero. And I'm really looking forward to their discussion. We're coming off a great, incredible press week for the Institute. We got mentions in Fox. We got mentions in the Daily Signal, which is the blog project of the Heritage Foundation. We got to join John Solomon and Amanda Head for their television show. We got some national media. Amazing, incredible week. And that update being over, I'm going to turn it over to our VP of Research, Mr. Dowd Muska. Dowd, thank you so much for taking control of everything today. I'm really excited to have you host this week's episode, and we'll bring Rebekah Paxton on. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebekah. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. And folks, if you want to check out all of our big media appearances this week, got some real national attention for our young and growing think tank. Just go to southwestpolicy.com. Okay. Why are we talking about the minimum wage? We are talking about the minimum wage because it's always an important issue, but in particular, earlier this month, on the 1st of this month, Nevada's minimum wage, one of our key states in the Southwest, raised its minimum wage. A number of California cities that impose minimum wages at the municipal level, a number of those went up, including the one in West Hollywood, California, that's the highest minimum wage in the country. So we're going to talk to Rebekah for the next 50 minutes or so about. We're going to start way back in history and the origin of the minimum wage, and then we're going to sort of get it more current in terms of what the research shows and maybe some better ways to help people who are trying to climb that ladder of success in employment. Along the way, if you're on the left, folks, we encourage you to tune in today because we're going to be talking about basic economic principles, things like trade-offs, opportunity costs, incentives, that sort of thing that help you as a human being understand the world, understand government, understand your own finances much, much better than that. But I'm going to kick things off as I often like to do with the data here on our region. Minimum wage at the state level in our 8 states. There are no state-imposed minimum wages in Oklahoma, Texas, and Utah. So the federal minimum wage, and we're going to get into the origin of that in a second, at $7.25 is the minimum wage in 3 of our states. Nevada, as I said earlier this month, it raised its minimum wage, I believe it was 75 cents. Nevada up at $11.25 an hour now. New Mexico even higher than Nevada at $12 an hour. Colorado, $13.65 an hour. Arizona, $13.85 an hour. And California, never to be outdone, at $15.50 an hour. And to kind of frame that in terms of the burden, New Mexico at $12 an hour has a higher minimum wage than Michigan and Ohio, and of course Pennsylvania, Indiana, and New Hampshire, which are at the federal level. Colorado has a higher minimum wage than Maryland, a very high-cost, expensive place on the East Coast. Arizona at $13.85 has a higher minimum wage than Illinois, home of corrupt Chicago, Illinois. So here in the Southwest, we boast about our embrace of capitalism, but boy, there's some examples there that are rather disturbing. Municipal level, and getting to our guests in a second. Flagstaff, Arizona, $16.80. California has 32 local municipalities. We're not going to go over every single one. At the highest, of course, as I just mentioned, West Hollywood, $19.08 an hour. In Colorado, Denver is $17.29 an hour, and the Santa Fe County and the city of Santa Fe are at $14.03 an hour. That gets you up to date on where we are in our 8 states of the American Southwest. But get our guest, Rebekah, and I'm 173 years of American history, the first European founding in 1565 in St. Augustine, Florida, Rebekah, the first continuously occupied settlement for 373 years. There was essentially no government control of wage levels on our continent in what eventually became the United States until 1938 with the Fair Labor Standards Act. 373 years of government not dictating wages, and 373 years of the United States developing the richest, most technologically advanced society in the world. How do we get so rich and so successful with no minimum wages?
Well, Dowd, it's a basic economic principle, right? Supply and demand. As businesses begin to thrive and begin to bring in more employees, right? It's a lot easier to attract good employees and keep them with good wages. And so, the basic economic principle of supply of labor and trying to attract them with competitive wages, right? Competition is a big part of that. It's a big cornerstone of the American economy. In order to get employees to come and stay at your business, you had to pay them more than the guy down the street. And so, for so long, like you said, for over 300 years, American businesses have been thriving by being able to look at their own bottom lines, run their own businesses as efficiently as they can, and pay workers as much as they can afford to, while creating a thriving business.
Sure. And I think so many of our friends on the left really struggled with the notion of each of us as a worker or laborer. We are, in fact, our own entrepreneurs. We're selling our labor services. We're going out into the marketplace and looking for someone to buy our, for those of us who do work. I mean, not everybody's Paris Hilton. Not everybody has a trust fund. A lot of us even enjoy our jobs, but people aren't. I think it's sad that people don't think of themselves as labor entrepreneurs selling their own services and wanting to sort of get the highest bidder. Tell us a little bit about the basics of the minimum wage as it exists now at the federal level, and then we'll break it down more state and locally. Who's impacted by the minimum wage? Are there any exceptions to the minimum wage? How many people in the labor force right now are earning the minimum wage?
Sure. So, like you said, the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 sort of created this baseline wage, and that's what it was meant to be, right? A minimum wage. I think we're seeing now that's a basic stepping block for a lot of employees, a lot of young people, a lot of entry-level folks to get their first job and to move up the ladder and eventually make more than the minimum wage. So the origins of this policy at the federal level and consequently also at the state level has always been to kind of set a floor, but that's the point, is that it's the floor and that employees can kind of move beyond that. Right now, the minimum wage at the federal level is $7.25 an hour. There is one major exception. There are several exceptions, but one major exception is for tipped employees. So your local servers and bartenders, other folks in the hospitality industry that earn regular tips. And there's federal law and state law that codifies what regular tips are. Those employees, by law, have to make at least $2.13 an hour at the federal level. States have different regulations on that. But employers have to count those regular tips into the minimum wage. We call that a tip credit. Employers can take a tip credit. So essentially, and what gets sort of misconstrued in the media and among progressives is that tipped employees still have to make the minimum wage. It's just that they're earning so much in tips that a lot of times those tips put them over the minimum wage. So there's sort of two tiers that we at the Employment Policies Institute talk about quite a bit. There are obviously other exceptions as well, but that's a major one, right? Is you have regular minimum wage earners and then you have tipped minimum wage earners who are honestly often earning more than the minimum wage. So in terms of how many folks are impacted, the federal minimum wage used to be the law of the land in the sense that not a lot of states went beyond that. Now we have, as you pointed out at the beginning, a lot of states are well beyond, double or even looking at triple what the federal minimum wage is. But the federal minimum wage, folks earning $7.25 an hour, that's about 1.1 million Americans who are paid hourly rates. They're getting paid at or below that minimum wage. That's about 1.4% of all hourly paid workers. So that means there's a lot of hourly paid workers that are paid much more than that. But when you think about the variance, that obviously doesn't capture folks who are earning state level minimum wages. At Employment Policies Institute, we did a study recently to look at the impact of, say, a $17 minimum wage, which has been proposed at the federal level. And, you're looking at many more people that would be affected by that. So if the minimum wage nationally would go up to 17, we're looking at about 12.8 million people affected. If you get rid of that federal tip credit that I mentioned, you're looking at more like 13.5 million people affected. So, currently it's a small subset of the workforce that's actually earning the minimum wage. A lot of that is due to the fact that they eventually get raises while they're on the job and succeeding at their jobs. But if you were to, double or even triple the federal minimum wage, you're looking at a lot more folks in the workforce that would be affected by that.
Sure. What industries are most affected by this? Because we often think of things like fast food, and there's a lot of things that Americans know about the economy that usually things are a lot more complicated than we think. But what are the breaking it down by sort of industrial sector? Who's impacted the most by this? Obviously, at the higher end, business services and IT and that kind of stuff, they're not as affected as other types of industries such as leisure and hospitality.
Sure. Yeah, you hit it right on the head. Leisure and hospitality is by large the largest employer of minimum wage workers, and particularly restaurants and bars, whether that's fast food or full service or sort of a hybrid model. Restaurants are acutely affected by this. I think it's about 2/3 of minimum wage workers are in the leisure and hospitality sector, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Other industries certainly are affected as well: retail, healthcare, but also government jobs, I think was the fourth highest category when I last checked. So, but by and large, like you said, it's leisure and hospitality, it's folks in restaurants. And again, a lot of folks that are earning that tipped minimum wage, that are earning tips, would be affected by this.
Sure. And of course, our friends on the left want to portray, in terms of the demographics or the typical profile of the minimum wage earner, they love to peddle this notion of it's the 35-year-old single mother who's exploited by a bad boss working for a big corporation that only cares about short-term profits. What is it's hard. I mean, there's a broad range of people who are earning the minimum wage, but it's a complex issue. That the notion that it's a huge portion of these people are 35-year-old single moms trying to support a family, that doesn't ring very true. Yes, I'm sure that happens, but it's a broad range of people, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has the most data on this. And so the largest share of minimum wage earners, like I said, are young folks, 16 to 24-year-olds. That's not to say that they don't deserve great wages, but generally 16 to 24-year-olds. And a lot of them are either single or they are not the primary earner in their household. So when we think about the minimum wage, it's important to think about households and not just the individual worker. And we'll get into the research later, but in fact, a lot of the folks who are considered working poor, that a lot of advocates of minimum wage hikes like to talk about when they talk about these policies, those folks actually aren't necessarily your typical minimum wage earner. They certainly exist. Like you said, there are certainly bad actors out there. There are bad employers who, aren't paying folks what they're worth. But by and large, minimum wage jobs are typically young folks, entry-level folks. They're either single or they're dual earners, or they live in a household with other earners. So it's across a wide variety of demographics and households. And in fact, there's a lot of research out there that says minimum wage hikes actually wouldn't really affect what we're calling the working poor, or employees that are in poverty.
Absolutely. Folks, you are watching SPPI television, SPPI-TV, episode number 17. We are talking with an expert from the Employment Policies Institute, Rebekah Paxton. This is a great group that I followed their research for years. I've been doing policy research for 30 years consistently, and we'll give out their contact information at the end too. Consistently doing good work, particularly labor issues, but particularly on the issue of minimum wage. If you want to weigh in with your comments, complaints, questions, whatever platform you're engaging us with, just send them off, and I will ask our experts. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts from our audience on this hot Friday in the American Southwest on the issue of the minimum wage. So send those comments, questions, etc. our way. Rebekah, I'd like to get back to you on. I think you might have briefly mentioned what I'd been looking at years ago, and I have to admit I haven't looked at the data all that recently, but the rapidity, the quickness in which a lot of people who do enter at the minimum wage, who do show up on time and demonstrate a work ethic, and as the old restaurant boss likes to say, if you got time to lean, you got time to clean. The idea that a lot of folks who do earn that minimum wage, if they are noticed by their managers, by their bosses, it's not too long before they do get promotions, which can lead to higher wages and for solid, reliable employees, and particularly in the labor market we have today, where employers are just desperate to bring people on. What's the current research on that? There was a significant body of research when I looked years ago showing that promotions and raises are pretty common for people who sign on at the minimum wage.
That's absolutely correct. And recent research, I think within the last 2 years, there was a study that was put out that showed the majority of minimum wage earners are actually getting a raise within 1 to 12 months of being on the job at a minimum wage job. So that's in less than a year, those folks, a majority of minimum wage earners are no longer making the minimum wage. They're making more than that. And, that has to do with, again, this demand for labor, especially in the current moment. Folks are still recovering from the pandemic, trying to restaff, trying to meet demand from customers. If you want to compete with your neighboring business, you got to retain your workers. And I think the research certainly shows that. And what we're seeing kind of on the ground, if you go to your local restaurant or go to a local store, folks are just clamoring for employees, and they're advertising it. We see a lot of starting jobs at $15, $16, $17 an hour, and those aren't mandated. Those are just the businesses trying to attract great workers. So yes, the research is certainly on that side and shows that these workers are getting raises, not years down the road, but within a year.
Yeah, and the other angle of this that I think is many, many angles that are ignored, or we're going to get into a media report that I think is quite illustrative of people in the media not grasping this concept. If you do have, and the research shows that there is a significant portion of people at the earning the minimum wage who are young, entry level, and I will say low skilled, not as a way to insult people who are in the minimum wage, or young people, or teenagers, or people in their 20s, but it's simply a descriptive term. If you are starting out and you're starting off your life, you are low skilled. You don't have decades of experience in your field. You're not an airline pilot. You're not a brain surgeon, and it takes time for most people, a vast majority of us, to build that skill set to sort of climb that ladder. But what is almost never discussed, Rebekah, and it's discussed by some of us in the libertarian free market sort of conservative world, is for people who are starting out at entry-level jobs and earning that minimum wage, and they may be grumbling about making the minimum wage, the benefits they are getting on the job they go beyond the wage. You are entering the workforce. You are learning how to interact with coworkers. You're learning what bosses care about, and the sort of behaviors and skills that they desire. You're learning those sort of soft skills. You might be dealing with customers as well. So yes, you may be paid a low wage relative to a CEO, but when you're starting off your work life, those are really valuable contributions that you earn at the lower end of the spectrum. It's not all exploitation and abuse.
Absolutely. And I don't know about you, Dad, but I myself, I worked at an ice cream stand in high school. That was my first job, minimum wage job. And I learned a lot of those great skills, right? Customer service, working with a large team, working with folks doing all kinds of different things in sort of the back of the house, right? Preparing, cleaning, serving, all of that, and working with a boss. And like you said, those are valuable skills that a lot of young folks, if they're not able to get these jobs, right? If you're increasing the premium, which is the minimum wage on these entry-level jobs, kids won't be able to get that stepping stone. They won't be able to get their foot in the door to eventually get those raises, but also to get other more skilled jobs down the road. So it's a really important stepping stone. Again, the intent of the federal minimum wage was to be a minimum and to create growth for American employees. That's going to get taken away if minimum wages kind of price out what businesses are able to afford, because businesses are also offering these jobs and offering these kind of trainings. They may be also offering other benefits. Again, tipped work opportunities can be very lucrative even for lower skilled folks. They may be offering healthcare. They may be offering tuition assistance for school, anything like that. College classes, things like that. Those are also great benefits, and the employer is not providing those for free either. So you have to kind of think about, an employer trying to do the best by their employees, trying to keep their business afloat so that they can continue to give those opportunities to employees. That's really important and critical for young folks or entry-level folks.
Yeah, and I listen to the Adam Carolla podcast every day. He's a very kind of vulgar blue collar guy, and he talks about barely making it out of high school and starting carpet cleaning the next day, and he calls them all his loser buddies, and how much he learned on the job. He came from an environment where everything was in the 1970s when everybody's parents were divorced and everybody was smoking marijuana, and the 1970s was the decade without standards in America, and how he was he was told to go get a crowbar or a level or some piece of construction equipment from the truck of the contractor he was working for, and he started walking toward the truck, and the guy clapped his hands and said, "Run!" He wanted Adam to run to the truck to get it. I mean, speed mattered on that job. It's those little kind of daily things you learn when you're starting off in the real world, what I would call it, not in government, in the real world. And those messages are sent, and if they're received, you can learn important lessons. We have set the background, and we're going to get into some numbers now, folks. We're here talking to Rebekah Paxton, Employment Policies Institute. This is episode 17 of SPPI television on a hot Friday afternoon in the American Southwest, talking about the minimum wage and just but labor issues beyond that, and the impact on the economy of the minimum wage. We're going to start with profit margin, Rebekah, and I do think that one of the problems with the minimum wage supporters is they're so ignorant of basic economics. They really do think that most employers are sitting around on piles of cash and would have no problem raising wages, and there wouldn't, it wouldn't impact their business in any way. It's those greedy bosses that are exploiting workers. I was raised on an apple orchard in New England that is still in business, and when I was taking care of my nephew for 11 years, helping raise that young boy who's off to college in the fall, we were doing cash up at the end of the night one October night, and he was looking at all the money that had come in and checks and credit card receipts and all that. And I said, "Well, buddy, we don't get to keep all that money. We have to actually pay out. How we hire people to come help us pick the apples, and then we have, the coolers, Grandpa's apple coolers down there that keep the apples cold. Then the electricity bill is really big for that." And he was looking at all that money, and I was giving example after example of where all the money goes from that. We don't sit around on piles of cash, and the wheels were turning in that little toddler brain, and he was starting to sort of figure it out. Talk about the issue of profit margin, Rebekah. I don't think the Bernie Bros and the AOC admirers really grasp the concept that a lot of our industries, a lot of individual businesses operate on very thin profit margins, and they don't have massive amounts of money sitting around to just throw to their employees. That's really not the economic reality of capitalism in America, is it?
Absolutely. And, I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think it's, for the government to kind of be throwing out these numbers, which, by the way, we were talking about the history of the minimum wage before. There was the notorious Fight for 15, which was a union-led campaign, but 15 wasn't an economic precedent. There wasn't a reason they chose that number. They just chose it because it rhymed and it sounded good, and they thought they could get it. And so now, you're seeing calls for $20, $30 minimum wages. They're saying these numbers, but they're not actually looking at individual businesses' bottom lines, right? And there's also a difference between companies who maybe have an economy of scope over their operations, right? Larger corporations who also may struggle with some of these mandates, but certainly to a different degree than your mom and pop shop, small franchises, things like that. They're not only not looking at profit margins, but they're not thinking about profit margins across the scope, right? There's all different business models and all different ways that folks are having to deal with regulations, taxes, rent, inflation. All of those things contribute to profit margins. So, and like you said, especially for industries like restaurants and hospitality, restaurants operate on a notoriously razor thin margin. A lot of times, just to stay afloat, it takes years to become a profitable restaurant, and that's just to keep your staff and to keep an operation and to innovate. Retail, healthcare, education; those are all really intensive businesses, and that money's going right back into the business. And so, for the government, again, to be able to say, well, you can afford $17, $20, $30, is really ignorant of the fact that a lot of these businesses, especially after the pandemic, are just trying to stay afloat and keep the employees they have. And that's why, as we'll get into, a lot of the research shows that companies are kind of forced to make this trade-off. Either they pay fewer employees at a higher minimum wage, or they kind of keep their minimum wage, retain their employees, build their skills, and are able to adapt over time and give them raises over time.
Yeah, I don't think we do ignorance in the American Southwest better than Santa Fe, New Mexico. And you're mentioning that the Fight for 15. I have unpacked a recent article from the daily newspaper up in Santa Fe. Some of us call it Fantasy. And I just to sort of touch upon the psychology of these people. And our guest will not be insulting this individual. I will be insulting this individual. So I want to make that extremely clear. I'm sure Rebekah doesn't even know who this person is. Scott Bunton. He is part of the Food Depot, a major northern New Mexico food bank. This is a recent article in the Santa Fe New Mexican. They issued a report. I guess they're not just a food dispenser of food, but they also advocacy. They are recommending an immediate increase in Santa Fe to a living wage, what they consider a living wage of $20 per hour, with incremental increases that will go up to possibly somewhere between $26 and $29 an hour. Now, Mr. Bunton, I guess he's from Washington, D.C. His last salary was at the U.S. Department of Commerce. He was making $154,000 a year as of 2007. I guess he's a retiree now, probably earning a federal pension, which I guess you, Mr. and Mrs. Viewer, will be paying for. According to Mr. Bunton, quote, the current minimum wage is $14 and something in Santa Fe, is no longer a living wage. And it's time for those of us who live in the city to step up to the plate. I don't know how much Mr. Bunton plans to give of his federal pension. Again, his last salary that I could find was $154,000. Not sure if he has any experience in entrepreneurship or creating jobs, but he wants the people in the city different to step up to the plate. Rebekah, I looked at the numbers these are the non-seasonally adjusted numbers. So I looked at just the month of May for Santa Fe, which has the highest minimum wage in New Mexico. 2019, before the lockdown, 70,400 jobs, dropping significantly the following year, 61,000, climbing up to 67,000 in 2021, climbing up to 70,000 in 2022. As of May 2023, earlier this year, 69,744 jobs. That is a lower number than the 70,390 jobs that Santa Fe had in May of 2019. Is that surprising to you that a community like Santa Fe, a deeply liberal community that piles regulation after regulation on their employers and is even considering a $20 or higher minimum wage, has no net growth over a 4-year period in employment in the Santa Fe metro? Would that surprise you folks at the Employment Policy Institute to see the numbers on that?
It doesn't. And quite honestly, that's the story that we're seeing across the country, especially in high wage cities, but at the state level too. We've done a lot of looks even before the pandemic, which can be even more striking because you don't have these added effects of government mandated business closures and things like that. If you look at cities like San Francisco, New York City, Chicago, Portland, Oregon, which have some of the highest, or at the time before the pandemic, had some of the highest minimum wages in the country, also don't allow tip credits. So those tipped restaurant workers are, being paid the regular minimum wage, and tips aren't counted in. They have some of the starkest drops in restaurant employment growth. And again, restaurants are where the majority of these minimum wage earners are working. They went from 3, 4, 5% annual growth in those industries for employment. And even before the pandemic, we're seeing net losses, thousands of jobs being slashed again before the pandemic. So it's not a surprise that again, these sort of more progressive lawmakers and progressive activists are pushing, again, they were pushing 15 for a long time. Now they're pushing 20 because 15 is sort of in the past. But it's also not a surprise that these cities have been seeing decline in affected industries for years. And, again, from the pandemic, we're seeing nationwide, the restaurant industry and other affected industries are still trying to recover. They're not back to regular employment levels like they were in 2019, 2020. But especially in these cities, they're struggling to rebound.
Yeah, I'm really glad you circled back to the tip issue, because one of the things that I've noticed just as a casual observer, not the level of knowledge you folks have at your organization, but the way in which some of the tipped employees are really, and this is not really so much a policy question so much as is more of a cultural and a sort of political activism question for you. There does seem to be a movement among the tipped employees. They are getting more and more organized. They're getting more. They're getting better at messaging and using social media. And you'll see pictures of managers with servers around them with the T-shirts on, saying, let us keep our tip-oriented compensation. What's your sense on that? It just seems to me like I didn't see that years ago, but I'm starting to see that more and more. These people are getting more aware and more engaged.
Absolutely. And at the Employment Policies Institute, we've been around for about 30 years. Not only do we work with small businesses and trying to understand how these minimum wage mandates affect them, but we also work with servers and employees. And we try to understand how these mandates affect the employees too, because that's really important. And I think, union activists, progressive activists like to kind of cherry pick circumstances and tout those in the media. But when you talk to a lot of, especially tipped workers, just as you mentioned, they are adamantly opposed by this. And that's because of that tip credit issue. A lot of employees are making far more than the minimum wage through their tips, and see tip credit elimination as creating kind of a flat wage mandate on their jobs. They don't want to make a flat wage. They want to make tips. They want to, walk away with, $200, $300 a night. And I think there was an interview on CNBC a couple of weeks ago where a New York City restaurant employer who had stopped tipping in his restaurants because he said, hey, we're going to do flat wages. We want it to be fair for everybody. He actually reversed that. And he said, on average, my servers were making $50 an hour. And I was taking that away from them by basically saying we're going to pay them a flat wage of 15, 20, 22. And so employees are getting much more in tune with sort of the activists' push to get rid of the tips, and they're winning, right? 2022 in Portland, Maine, pretty progressive city, pretty big liberal push there to not only raise the minimum wage to $18 an hour, but also get rid of the tip credit. Employees banded together, they organized, they talked to folks on the street, they talked to their customers at restaurants, and they defeated that ballot measure to eliminate the tip credit, I think 2-1, by a 2-1 margin. So the voice of the employees is really strong and it's really important. And, largely there's a lot of activists out there saying they're working on behalf of employees, but they're not.
And a lot of politicians too. And it boggles my mind that people like Elizabeth Warren think they know someone's economic situation and their prospects better than they do, and should be dictating these terms. One example, this is the extreme example, going from Santa Fe to West Hollywood. I don't know which is worse, but this was covered by the Associated Press just a couple of days ago. Chief executive of the upscale restaurant La Boheme, kind of place that's probably a little more upscale than I can afford, but in West Hollywood, he had an interview with the LA Times, and one of the things that we haven't really gotten into the specific outcomes of minimum wage and minimum wage increases. We're going to start unpacking that because there's probably 6 or 7 major impacts of that. But cutting back staff, because if you don't have piles of cash lying around to raise all your wages for all your employees, you have to start laying people off. The chief executive of this very Tony restaurant said he has cut staff from 120 to 80, so that's 40 of his 120 employees cut. City's minimum wage, of course, climbed last time. It climbed up to $17.50. It's now $19.08. Rebekah, when I read, and I don't do it often because I know how bad it's going to be, when I read the news coverage of a state or a city, on the 1st of January, the 1st of July, that the minimum wage going through, it drives me. It makes my blood boil. I'm just looking for the right metaphor. It makes my blood boil that all too often the announcement, or maybe the headline, or maybe the subhead, or maybe the lead will be, well, employees can be happy in Albuquerque or Tucson because 3 days from now they're all getting a pay raise, and the enumeration of the unintended consequences of this policy are very rarely discussed by a lot of very silly journalists who aren't really journalists. Let's start with layoffs. We can go down the list. There's a lot of other impacts that we can talk to. But yes, you may be one of the lucky employees who gets a pay hike, but that's cold comfort or small comfort to someone who's getting their hours cut back or getting laid off.
Absolutely. And the research certainly shows that. There's 30 years of minimum wage research. There's more than that, but in the last 30 years, overwhelmingly, economists find that minimum wage hikes cause significant job loss. And again, specifically for young folks, specifically for less skilled folks, they tend to be first on the chopping block. And so, as we're watching some of these minimum wages rise, it sounds like a great deal, and if you're not listening to workers, you're not listening to businesses, it sounds like a winning solution. But like you said, there's always a trade-off. And the bottom line of this policy is that, yes, you may have some folks that win higher wages, and they benefit from that. But then for all the folks who are getting a wage hike, there's folks that are losing their jobs, right? And their minimum wage now becomes zero, which is sort of a classic argument from folks at the New York Times back in the day, and many economists. Or they might be losing hours, they might be losing other compensation that comes along with that, and we can delve into that. But things like benefits, things like tuition assistance, healthcare, things like that, those things also start to go by the wayside, because then, if employers feel that they have to scale down their workforce, if they have to scale down hours, now you're cutting people out of, full-time territory, and that has implications for earning benefits. And I want to stress that, in most cases, employers want to do right by their employees. They don't want to shrink their work hours. They don't want to pay them less. They don't want to lay them off. But if they have to close down, everybody at the company loses their jobs. So it's a very bad trade-off. And activists and politicians like to focus on that shiny number, right? 15, 17, 20. But they're not thinking about the darker number, which is how many thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, if you're looking at the whole country, would lose their jobs with mandates like this.
Sure. And the other aspect of getting rid of personnel is, in some ways, I don't know there's a formal way to quantify this, but with digital technology, with AI, with the rise of robotics, robots that can make pizza, robots that can do kitchen duties and that kind of stuff, cleaning robots, all that kind of stuff. Automation is racing ahead. Robotics is racing ahead. What are you seeing in terms of ordering kiosks? You can go to McDonald's and punch up your order on the kiosk in a lot of McDonald's franchises now that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. Our employees, our employers, are they more and more embracing some of these technological solutions to minimum wage hikes? Because it seems that would be sort of an obvious point of attraction for them when the Elizabeth Warrens of the world just keep making their costs go up.
Absolutely. And I think it was, I don't want to misspeak here, but I'm pretty sure McDonald's just pioneered a fully technology-run restaurant. I want to say it was either in California or Texas, I'm not sure. But companies are starting to innovate in those ways, because technology is often a one-time or a maintenance cost. But if you're employing, and if that replaces people who are working for higher and higher minimum wages, sometimes employers feel like that's a better investment, and that's an unfortunate side effect of the minimum wage going up. I'll give you a local example. So I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. And here we just had a ballot measure to eliminate the tip credit. So raise the minimum wage for tipped workers up to, right now it's $16.10 an hour. The tip credit is going away in phases. So, eventually the minimum wage in D.C. in a couple of years is going to be $17 an hour for those tipped workers. And we did a survey of restaurant owners, a majority of whom were small chains or single location operators. And they said in the large cases, they're going to start to move towards automation. Again, they're going to implement layoffs or change their payment structure or things like that. But automation was a big theme for them, or having to move out of the district entirely.
Yeah, it's... Don't get me started on the nation's capital and all of its problems. Folks, you are watching SPPI-TV, episode number 17. We are lucky to have Rebekah Paxton with us from the nation's capital, the swamp itself. And fortunately, she's not batting away mosquitoes and all the other vermin that live in that place. Proud to say I haven't been in the swamp since 2008, late 2008. And if I never go back, that's fine with me. She's with the Employment Policies Institute, a great organization that's been around for decades, really unpacking the research on the minimum wage and other labor issues too. But minimum wage is sort of their baby. If you want to weigh in with your comments, criticisms, questions, please interact however you want on whatever platform you're in. I will be happy to read all polite comments and questions. Of course, no, keep it clean, ladies and gentlemen. Keep it clean. Our audience always would. I'm going to ask Rebekah, about our state of Nevada, our beloved state of Nevada. I lived there for a number of years, one of our anchor states here in the American Southwest. Nevada just went up to, I believe they just had it was a 75 cents hike in Nevada. So we were up at, where are we up at now in Nevada? 11.25 in Nevada. Not asking you for any particular intense knowledge of the state of Nevada, Rebekah, but that is leisure and hospitality central. It is also a state that suffered from terrible lockdowns. We don't need to get into that debate today, but I was there on one occasion when they were yelling at me for not wearing a mask, and don't forget, we all go all the way back to Barack Obama telling people not to go to Las Vegas. That wasn't a very popular comment back in the day. Nevada, Rebekah, has the highest unemployment rate in the country. We're very sad to say our Southwest economy is extremely strong in so many ways, but one area of real weakness for us is Nevada, a higher unemployment rate than the other 49 states. With a brand new 75-cent a hike wage in a state like Nevada that's heavily dependent on leisure and hospitality, how does that impact the state that's really hurting in terms of people who are trying to get back into the workforce?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a lot of things that contribute to unemployment, as you know. The minimum wage certainly could be one of them. Essentially, from where we're at now, further raising the minimum wage is only another regulation on top of businesses that prevents them from creating more jobs, from entrepreneurs who want to open up shops, they want to employ folks. It discourages that. It's just another regulation that puts a damper on entrepreneurialism and business growth. So those opportunities, if they exist now and businesses are able to hold on and employ folks at that minimum wage, great. But it certainly could bode poorly for the future for businesses trying to open up and employ more folks in Nevada. There are studies that minimum wage contributes to inflation. I sort of think of it as a snowball effect. As minimum wages go up, prices go up. That's demonstrated in the literature. But then as prices go up, you have activists saying across the country now, well, inflation's gone up, so wages have to go up because purchasing power has gone down, right? And so it's a vicious cycle. And that only contributes to the welfare of unemployed folks. And it continues to put pressure on costs for businesses in other ways. Their input costs, food costs, supply chain issues. All these pressures sort of mount on businesses all at once. Don't forget government regulations, taxes, permitting issues. All of that kind of stacks on top of a business, and minimum wage certainly discourages folks from opening up new employment opportunities, and that only hurts unemployment prospects and hurts the workers of Nevada.
Sure, and another aspect of this, and you folks just put this up a few days ago on your website, a professor at University of UCal San Diego, which is I hadn't even thought of this myself. New research on the minimum wage's impact on homelessness, and anybody who spent any time along the Las Vegas Strip knows that is that's an issue in certainly in Las Vegas. I can't speak for the rest of Nevada. Demonstrated effect of minimum wage hikes to cause job loss may trigger homelessness for those affected. This seems to be kind of a new argument against the minimum wage that I'm not familiar with. So can you walk us through that research and what the professor found and kind of what his approach was to determining that?
Absolutely. So he basically found that minimum wage hikes at the state level. He looked at various state levels. So again, you have the federal minimum wage, but you have all kinds of states tinkering on their own timelines, some in January, some in July, some in September, in different legislative sessions, all tinkering with minimum wages. And so in order to kind of get that random study quality, he looked at all these different state minimum wages and looked at the counts of homeless folks in those states, and basically found that as you raise the minimum wage, homeless counts go up. And he attributed that, listen, this is a working paper, so I'm sure he's going to be kind of honing that argument and honing his results and making sure they stand up to peer scrutiny. But it's a really interesting look, and a lot of folks have weighed in on this study already, saying it's a really solid piece of research. And he attributes this to a couple of different things. I mean, homelessness, again, like unemployment, is caused by many things, many different factors. But he essentially says, for lower skilled entry level folks who get jobs and are affected by minimum wages, they tend to be first on the chopping block. So for folks that are vulnerable, maybe they've been homeless before, maybe they're trying to enter the workforce again, or folks that have been out of the workforce for a variety of reasons, trying to enter the workforce, minimum wage hikes of this kind make it that much harder for them to break in. And so, vulnerable populations, if you will, tend to be first at the chopping block if they don't have, certain skills, right? Because an employer is probably going to keep on folks that have higher skills for the same price as, someone who has lower skills. So it targets those folks who have lower skills and who may be trying to get their foot in the door, trying to get an entry-level job to move up and get those raises and move on to bigger and better things, and they just can't. And so he attributes that to the number of homeless in a lot of these states.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think the issue of labor force participation, which we're still struggling with in this country, there's still a lot of people sitting on the sidelines. You pay people not to work, and you free them from having to pay their rent, little minor things like that. And expand Medicaid, and people aren't as motivated to go out and pay their bills. But that's, I suppose, a topic for another day. We are running desperately low on time. I wanted to ask Rebekah about, because we do have throughout the West places like Flagstaff and places like Santa Fe and Albuquerque and Las Cruces and Denver. Is the pace of local minimum wage adoption, is it accelerating? Is it about where it was? We talked about the resistance from wait staff who are doing very well with their tipped incomes. How does it look sort of moving forward on that? Maybe it's asking too much at the state level, but at least are we slowing the trend toward minimum wage adoption at the municipal level, which can be even worse in the cities, much significantly higher and more of a burden on employers?
That's a great question. I think over the last couple of years that I've been specifically looking at local minimum wages, I do think you're seeing more and more of them introducing them on ballots for voters to vote on, which again, if you're not familiar necessarily with the trade-offs, it sounds like a great idea. So I think specifically the trend of local ballot measures, even state ballot measures, on the minimum wage, that has been increasing, and the numbers are just getting higher and higher. So, just looking at the media coverage, it feels like it's all over the place. Another trend, especially at the local level, that's interesting is tying these increases to inflation, so that the legislature basically never has to act on it again. It's just kind of baked in to the law. So, in terms of the local level, we're seeing that a lot, especially those municipalities in California. I believe Santa Fe is tied to inflation. Other states, I think Arizona's state minimum wage is tied to inflation, and therefore, going up every year. So that seems to be kind of troubling as well, is that more and more jurisdictions, whether they're local or state, are taking this inflation adjustment angle so that, voters never have to think about it again or have to, hold their lawmakers accountable again. It's essentially just baked into the law, and then, tipped workers or other workers or businesses have to sort of make it their mission to take down laws that are already in existence. So I'm not sure if the volume has gone down. I'm not sure if it's gone up, but I think you're seeing more and more of these sort of creative ways, if you will, to raise the minimum wage and do it kind of without voter and employee and business input.
Well, they like to exert their power in surreptitious ways often. They like that with the gas tax too, to index that to inflation, to sort of remove accountability for state legislators on that. That's another fight for another day. We're going to wrap up our final 5 minutes with Rebekah, asking her kind of a two-part, very open-ended question. What would America, a glorious American future of no federal, no state, no municipal minimum wages, what if they were all repealed tomorrow? What would that America look like? And then part two of that question, for those of us who, I hope it will be all of us, want people to earn higher wages. We want people to have more economic success in their life. What are some of the policy options? As a libertarian, I'm more inclined to remove public policies to help people rather than implement public policies, but we could have a healthy debate on that. Rebekah, America freed from the minimum wage and smarter proposals, proven proposals to help people who are maybe starting off their careers at the lower end of the spectrum. And we got a few minutes left to sort of kick around those ideas.
Sure. I mean, you know, I'd say, listen, there's a lot of really great business owners out there. There's a lot of great employees. You know, there's always going to be bad actors. And so I think, you know, you could say the Fair Labor Standards Act was sort of a way to try to curb those bad actors. But I think essentially what we're seeing even now, you know, with companies that are trying to raise their wages beyond statutory minimum wages just to attract workers. I mean, I think that's sort of wage supply and demand in action, and that's what should happen and what will happen. You know, employees also have a voice, and I think we're at a moment, you know, with labor unions and things like that, which is kind of a separate conversation. But you know, employees have a voice and have been vocal about, you know, what they want on their workplace. And I think the beauty of capitalism, the beauty of you know, trade-offs and supply and demand is that if your employer isn't treating you properly, if your employer isn't paying you enough, you know, you need to go somewhere else. And people do. And I think people are bouncing around in a lot of ways. And you're seeing that. You're seeing companies raise their wages just to try to attract and keep workers. And so I think employers who know what they're doing and who want to retain good employees know that, and they want to pay their workers what they're worth and pay them as much as they can. And I think employees know that as well. And so I think, you know, without minimum wages, it's, you know, really flexing that muscle of supply and demand, and let's all come to a, you know, consensus that works for the business and works for employees and works for the business owner. You know, in terms of other policies that could alleviate some of these pressures, you know, we talk about the earned income tax credit quite a bit. Any policy that sort of supplements working, supplements wages, is a better one than the minimum wage. And I think a lot of the research too on minimum wages shows that these things don't address poverty because they don't address poor workers. And so if you're actually boosting the wages of poor workers, you're going to alleviate poverty much better than minimum wage. A majority of economists would say that the earned income tax credit, Section 8 housing vouchers, expanding food stamps and things like that are much better for addressing poverty than the minimum wage. You know, and you could debate, you know, the efficacy of those programs and oversight, but I think also, you know, deregulating the business environment in a way that businesses are able to start, to grow, to employ workers, you know, and thrive, as well as helping those workers to thrive, would be a good starting point instead of just hiking minimum wages for the sake of kind of politics.
Yeah, all worthy topics of discussion. And I will just, on a point of personal privilege, I'm not speaking for our guest or her organization. I would say cutting the payroll tax, which is the cruelest tax in the history of the world, where young people in America are being taxed to support the wealthiest people in America, older people. That's a whole can of worms. We're not going to get into. I won't get into that one either. But wow, that payroll tax is cold and cruel, and we don't have nearly enough agitation to attack that one. Our guest today has been Rebekah. Rebekah is with the the Employment Policies Institute. We got to get it right, because there are some other EPI entities out there we do not want to support. Rebekah Paxton, Research Director for the Employment Policies Institute. Rebekah, if people want to learn more about your group and the really solid research you guys are putting up constantly on your website, either generated in-house or just highlighting the work of others on issues like the minimum wage, where can people go to learn about the Employment Policies Institute?
Yeah, our website is epionline.org. We also run a blog at minimumwage.com, where we're keeping up on some of the more current issues. You know, we do a lot of our research on EPI Online, but issues of the day at minimumwage.com.
Great. Thank you for joining us, Rebekah. We'd love to have you back as soon as we can. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you
folks,
so much.
you have been watching SPPI-TV, episode number 17. Please check us out at southwestpolicy.com. You can see some of our major national media attention we've been getting lately that Patrick was talking about at the beginning of the program. Read our work, make a tax-deductible contribution, and if nothing else, you know, spread the word about our work, share us on social media, follow our accounts, and that kind of thing. Our mission is to preserve the health and strength and vigor of our region, and fix the problems that do exist, so we can continue to stand, the American Southwest can continue to stand as a beacon of opportunity and, dare I say, hope for our beleaguered nation. The numbers show that people love the Southwest, and more of you are coming our way. Southwestpolicy.com. Check us out, folks, and we will return next Friday afternoon. Thank you.